Thanks for staying tuned to your station, the Africa Independent Television, and welcome to your program. Wherever you are watching us, this is your program, Security Watch Africa. My name still remains Patrick Abambu. Today, we'll be bringing you a very interesting topic. We're looking at a very interesting topic that all Africans are actually concerned and asking this question. I will unfold it after our reports, but I want to point out that some things that are happening in Nigeria that needs urgent attention of Mr. President, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, the tussle between the Economic and Financial Crime Commission and the former governor of Kogi State, Yaya Bello. There is need for the president to look into it because it seems that some people are taking the laws into their hands. Yes, quickly, let me tell you that we have two important reports, after which we'll bring in our guest, an international security analyst, who will be looking at this topic, Africa's seat at the United Nations Security Council. Is it possible? Really, that is a question that every African is asking right now. Some believe it's possible. Some said, no, with the situation in Africa, it's not possible. But our guest today has the knowledge to tell us what should be done or where we are in that case. But let's go straight now to the Army headquarters where Shilu Daniels brings us a report of what happened, the media briefing that took place during the week.
The Nigerian Army has reaffirmed that it is a professional force committed to the highest standards of discipline, integrity, and accountability. This affirmation was made by the Director, Army Public Relations, Major General Onyema Nwachukwu, while briefing the media on the ex-Private Ruth Ogunleye's case.
There were other senior officers that were alleged by ex-Private Ruth Ogunleye to have sexually harassed her, intimidated her, and subjected her to trauma in the course of her service. This individual, ladies and gentlemen, has been relentless in her online campaign against Colonel Abdul Karim, a matter that the Army can no longer overlook. Let me begin by clearly stating that the Nigerian Army is a professional force committed to the highest standards of discipline, integrity, and accountability. It is guided by rules and regulations that ensure every officer and soldier operate within the framework of respect for human rights and due process. In line with this, the Nigerian Army takes every accusation leveled against its personnel seriously and has established procedures to investigate any claim made against its personnel.
Major General Nwachukwu spoke more on the case.
The case of ex-Private Ruth Ogunleye, who claims to be a former subordinate of Colonel I.B. Abdul Karim at the Nigerian Army Medical Corps headquarters in Lagos, is no exception to our commitment to due process. Upon receipt of her initial complaint, which included allegations of sexual harassment, the Nigerian Army took immediate action. The matter was referred to the Nigerian Army Corps of Military Police and tasked with conducting thorough investigation into the veracity of her claims. The investigation was conducted in line with established protocols, with every effort made to ensure a fair and impartial process. It is crucial to assert that the Nigerian Army, in its bid to ensure justice and transparency, conducted an exhaustive review of the facts, testimonies, and evidence presented. The investigation concluded that Colonel I.B. Abdul Karim did not commit the offense of sexual harassment as alleged by ex-Private Ruth Ogunleye. The findings were definitive and based on objective evaluation of the available information. The Army maintains that Colonel I.B. Abdul Karim is a disciplined, regimented, and firm officer who has upheld the values of the Nigerian Army throughout his service.
The director disclosed that the Nigerian Army further referred ex-Private Ogunleye to the National Hospital in Abuja for alternative medical evaluation and outcome of the medical report.
That ex-Private Ruth Ogunleye had been recommended for discharge on medical grounds since 2022. But the Nigerian Army, being sympathetic to its own, thought it wise to give her the best medical treatment possible, stabilize her before discharging her into the wider society. Hence, while the Army was addressing the allegations of sexual harassment, further concerns about Ruth Ogunleye's conduct came to light. Her behavior, both online and offline, raised questions about her worsening mental health and emotional stability. Consequently, the Nigerian Army referred ex-Private Ruth Ogunleye for medical evaluation at the National Hospital in Abuja, following earlier assessments made by the Nigerian Army Medical Corps that suggested potential mental health concerns. This decision was taken to safeguard her well-being and to ensure that any action taken by the Nigerian Army was informed by a comprehensive understanding of her condition as advised by trained professionals. The medical evaluation confirmed that ex-Private Ruth Ogunleye was suffering from a condition that made her medically vulnerable.
Shuli Daniels, Security Watch Africa.
Welcome back. Yes, let's quickly take you to the Defense Headquarters where Lisbeth Tanko brings us a report of what the Armed Forces of Nigeria have done in the last 3 months.
The need for citizens to cooperate with the Armed Forces of Nigeria, AFN, in the fight against all forms of criminalities has been stressed by the Director, Defense Media Operations, Major General Edward Buba. The Director stated this while briefing the media on the achievements of the AFN troops in the third quarter of the year 2024.
The lifeline of terrorism is the people. You cannot win terrorism without the support of the people. And I would say that winning this war is not just dependent on the military, our weapons, and finances. It is largely dependent on the people.
Major General Buba added that the outcome of troops' offensive against enemies of the nation is huge, as 65 prominent terrorist leaders and commanders were killed.
The troops' offensive actions have culminated in the neutralization of several notable terrorist leaders, commanders, and combatants across all the theaters of operations that we're involved in. Significantly, 65 senior terrorist leaders were wiped off the battlefield during the third quarter of this year. Some of those that have been wiped off include, and not limited to, the following: Munzir Arika, Sani Daila, also known as Dan Hausawa Jibil Laram Ta Kimbi Njoku, and Jacob Nzige, as well as Ibn Kazir, among several others.
He further gave breakdown of total achievements recorded by the troops in the third quarter of the year 2024.
Troops in the third quarter of this year neutralized 1,937 terrorists, arrested 2,782 suspects, and rescued 1,854 kidnapped hostages in the course of the third quarter operations of this year. Troops recovered 1,304 weapons, 43,347 ammunition, and we denied the oil theft of an estimated sum of over 13 billion naira during the course of our operations in the third quarter of this year.
Elizabeth Thanko, reporting for Security Watch Africa, Abuja.
Thanks for staying tuned to our program, Security Watch Africa. Now we go to the discussion segment of this program, where we have our guests joining us online via Zoom from the United Kingdom. I'm talking about my brother David Otto, who is an international security analyst. Yeah, bro, good to see you.
Good to see you, Mr. Patrick, and thank you for inviting me to have these discussions, at Africa Security Watch. I think, this is an enormous, program that, looks into very critical issues, regarding Africa. I think, I'm delighted, to be invited to have these conversations, for the benefit of the continent, of course.
Thank you so much. Yes, like the topic, it says African seat at the United Nations. Is it possible, really? Maybe I should start from that, because maybe for the benefit of those who may not know, what is the Security Council actually all about? We know that there are about 15 members, but there are 5 permanent members, and incidentally, in these 5 permanent members, no African country is one of them. And there have been, over the years, there have been clamor for Africa to at least have 1 seat there, at least. But can you tell us, what really is this Security Council all about? And who are those that are currently members?
Yeah, so I think it's very important, Mr. Patrick, in having this discussion regarding the United Nations and the Security Council, to have a very good context, particularly if we're talking about the fact that we are looking towards Africa having a permanent seat at the Security Council. And not just that, there's also talk about Africa being able to have the veto right. So you've got to look at the whole background of the United Nations as a whole. I mean, this was an establishment that was formed in 1945. It's precisely the 26th of June, and at that time, it had 50 members. Amongst those 50 members, you just had 4 African countries, who were part of the signatories on that fateful 26th of June. And amongst those members, of course, you had countries like Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. So you've got to understand that these were the countries. I'm talking about 1945. So in that period, very few African countries had their independence. Countries like South Africa, they had already had their independence. Of course, they were under the now what we call now the apartheid regime. Ethiopia, of course, had its independence before. Liberia in the 1840s, had its independence, and of course, Egypt, which was part of the Ottoman Empire under the British. So these were the 4 African countries that were the original members of the United Nations when it was established. And remember, Patrick, that the United Nations was established as a result of the failure of what was known at that time as the League of Nations, because the League of Nations had failed, and the League of Nations had failed to stop the Second World War, because the League of Nations, as you know, was created, after the First World War. This was as a result of the 14 points, that were brought forward by the United States President then, Woodrow Wilson. The 14th of that point, was to establish the League of Nations. And at that point in time, remember that Africa was being, divided into various, mandated territories, and some went to France, some went to, Germany, and the rest of that. And the permanent members, remember, this is quite important. The permanent members of the United League of Nations are UK, because the United States, failed to become a member, because the US Congress had opposed that. So you've got to remember that this idea of a permanent membership of the United Nations, which of course now we have the United Nations Security Council, had already been established long time ago. So the UN that you see today is has the same structure, Patrick, like the League of Nations that you had then. And the League of Nations was never established for the benefit of African countries. It was established strictly for the benefit of the Western countries who were fighting each other, who had spheres of influence within Africa. So Africa was never a priority. So it's very critical to understand that. So the formation and the established, the 5 members of the Security Council, it's a reflection and implication of what happened in the League of Nations. So permanent membership has always existed, and it has always been for what we refer to as the Big Five. Of course, we talk about UK, France, China, US, and Russia. They've always been there. And this veto power, this permanent membership, the Big Five members, they do not want to give away their power.
Yeah.
So you've got to understand that. But also, this is quite critical, Patrick, to understand, is that when Africa talks about having a permanent membership, remember I mentioned to you that when the UN was created in 1945, after the Second World War, of course, had ended, only 4 African countries were members. And a lot of the African countries that joined, for example, Nigeria joined on the 7th of October, 1960. It got its independence on the 1st of October, 1960. Now, these countries were still very young, and they were not the original members of the UN. So when we are looking today about whether Africa is going to have a permanent seat at the United Nations, you did mention very correctly that currently you have 15 members. Initially, permanent members became 10, but these 15 members, 5 of them are permanent, the rest rotationary after 2 years. So there has always been a protection by the so-called 5 permanent members of the UN with the veto power. They do not want to see a break of that relation, something that they have already created, a structure that protects their own interests. So it has been very difficult. And even if, Patrick, that an African country were to get a seat or a permanent seat, the question is, are they going to be able to get the veto power that they require? So from a practical point of view, it's not just about Africa. What about countries like Brazil, like India? Remember, if you look at the dynamics of what is going on, even if you look at the most powerful, what they call the firepower index, the countries with the most powerful military, African countries do not appear in the first 10. The only country that appears 15th is Egypt. If you look at the global firepower index, so there are other countries besides Africa that are also fighting, the likes of Japan, the likes of Brazil, the likes of South Africa. So membership has to be looked at very critically. So we've got to be very careful in terms of what we are asking for, because other countries are thinking, why should we give Africa permanent membership? Now, the argument, which is very critical, Patrick, is that Africa, of course, by 2050, 1 in 4 people in the world are going to be Africa. Africa has 54 members, which is quite critical.
Yeah.
These are all advantages, that Africa has. It has, a huge, I think when you talk about the voting rights within the General Assembly, Africa has about 28%.
28%.
Followed, of course, by Asia with 27%, Americas with 17%, and of course, Western Europe with 15%. So Africa has the biggest, share of the General Assembly vote. But as far as getting a permanent seat is concerned, the big boys, I call them, the Big Five, the Europeans, the ones who created this UN for their own purpose at the time when Africa was still colonized, they do not really want to see, Africa becoming a permanent member of the United Nations. But much can be discussed. I'll let you.
Exactly. Fa, you have given the total breakdown of the background for this discussion. Unfortunately, I know time is a problem, but looking at our strength, we have to about 25% voting right at the General Assembly, but it seems to be
28 actually. 28.
Okay, 28. Yeah, with the 54 members and all that, but looking at the interest in Africa, for instance, we have these nations, these big five, having different control in some countries. We have the French, we have the English people, we have the Germans, we have the Russia is getting so strong now. We have India and China also playing a very big role in the continent. Don't you think that their interest in Africa will also jeopardize, if any reason, if for any factor, Africa will have gotten a permanent seat?
Well, I think that's very critical. I mean, these countries do not want to see an African country, because when we talk about Africa, we're talking about 54 countries here. So the question is going to be, Patrick, which of the African states are going to get a permanent seat? And there is also the dispute. The likes of, again, as I mentioned, Egypt, South Africa, even Liberia and Ethiopia would say, listen, we were the first original members. We signed the charter on the 26th of June, 1945. We should be the permanent members. They can also say, countries like, Egypt, Algeria, could also argue that we've got the biggest army in the world. Nigeria comes third in terms of, the biggest army in Africa. Nigeria comes third in terms of the biggest army. So why should we give it to someone else? So there has to be, in my opinion, an agreement. And this is why the African Union is quite critical, because we have an African Union. We have an African Union where the African countries can sit down and, have a plan in terms of who is going to be the permanent member. So it's not just about the UN Security Council 5 members agreeing, which of course is a difficult position for them to agree to give a particular African country. It's also about what the African countries do, when they sit at the African Union and say, we should, select a particular country. But the geopolitics is so powerful.
Yeah.
Individual country interest is so powerful in such a way that it will be very difficult to have a particular African country. So, for example, Nigeria say, let's give it to South Africa, or South Africa says, let's give it to Nigeria, or let's give it to Egypt. That becomes a difficult situation because the sovereignty of each country is very critical. So, I mean, my understanding, Patrick, has been and always been that although Africa is a very powerful continent, again, as I mentioned, by 2050, 1 in 4 human beings will be Africans. Although Africa is so powerful and the world recognizes that, I think, the United Nations was never, made for Africa. Of course, they called it the United Nations, but it was made, for Western Europe, the Asia, perhaps not even for Asia, perhaps, well, you can include Asia because China, you've got the East as well, Russia, you've got, the United States, when it comes to the Americas. So it was never done for that. But so I think it's quite critical to understand that, the only way that Africans or an African country can grab a seat or a permanent seat, I'm not talking about veto yet, because that the veto power is going to be quite critical.
It's reserved, yeah.
If we combine our forces together and perhaps, even, at some point, gang up to suspend ourselves, from the United Nations if we don't get a permanent seat. That is one way that, can be done. But,
I was going to come in there. Sorry to cutting you there, because I think that if Africa can decide to say, look, we are not participating in the United Nations program, so as a way to get the United Nations, the big boys, to now say, okay, please let us have one of you. But I think you have touched a critical point there. Can any of these countries in Africa agree for the other to be given that seat? And another problem is, don't you think that the non-aligned membership, non-aligned factor may come in? Because it seems that most of these African countries, they are not too truly, so to say, non-aligned, because they seem to be leaning towards one of these blocks, global blocks. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, that's a critical point, and this is why you've got this controversy regarding and this geopolitics, this diplomacy, who is linked to who is supporting who, and you've got these 5 members, the likes of China, Russia, the United States, the UK, the France, each and every one of them, seeming to have support, from one African country or a couple of African countries against the other. So, in itself, Africa has been divided, when it comes to reliance by these 5 permanent members. So we are not united as a continent. Some countries would abstain, if there is a vote that is against China, and then vote, against Russia or vice versa, or, against the United States. So because African countries are not united in and of themselves, it becomes a very challenging position for them to unify or even perhaps boycott. As a continent, the United Nations General Assembly, and perhaps just send a representative from the African Union to say, members will not attend this particular, General Assembly. We are boycotting, ourselves until we get a permanent seat at the United Nations. But the question is, why do we need a permanent
seat? I think. Sorry,
yeah,
maybe
that's another question.
Yeah, maybe there we'll have to pause for this week. We're going to continue this conversation because it's getting very interesting. Because one of the things I will have asked is that African member countries going to these big boys with cap in hand, begging for one largesse or the other. Do you think that the big boys will accept for you? After you have come to beg from me for your survival, you're coming to be a member of my club. But anyway, this will be part of the discussion, the part 2 of this discussion. It's been our pleasure having you, taking your time to talk on this issue, which is very, very important. Thanks. Thank you once again. Yes, viewers, you had that discussion. Yes, a lot of people have talked about how interesting this topic was going to be, and you can see that we can't exhaust it with this episode. We'll have to continue next week so that we can truly deal with these issues. Until we come over again next week, I say thanks for staying tuned, and bye for now.